Hello and welcome to How to Be a Better DM. My name is Tanner Wayland, and I'm going to help you today learn how to have fun and creative experiences as a DM with crafting items. Now, if you know anything about the current state of crafting, it's at least in the fifth edition. It's a little simple and unimaginative, and it needs a lot of help, to put it simply. To give you an example, basically in the actual like player's handbook and the dungeon master's guide, it really doesn't do like tell you a lot. It gives you kind of like, okay, if you want to create an item, and it's not even saying anything like magical or anything like that. If you want to create an item, you have to spend 1 day to generate 5 gold points of value. And then you also have to spend like some gold on raw materials. Now, as you can see, it's like, okay, so if you needed to make an item worth, let's say 1,500 gold pieces, you're looking at 300 days. And that's, that's going to kill any player's creativity who really wants to make something. And you're like, okay, you got 300 days of downtime. And of course they don't. No one does. Like, frankly, downtime stints or periods of time are few and far between in D&D, unless of course you do a time jump, which I always love that mechanic. But the good news is that there was a little bit added on to the basic rules, to the rules in general, with Xanatar's guide to everything. Basically, in that guide, they add a little bit more info for like, okay, scribing scrolls, potions of healing, and then like what it looks like to craft a magical item. But in the end, I feel like all of this, how they kind of present it, it's very meat and potatoes. This is what you need. This is how much time / gold you need to spend. And it lacks imagination. It doesn't tell a story. And it also, in some ways, makes the process either too simple or too expensive / too time consuming. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to be talking about how to essentially fix crafting. And we're not going to overcomplicate it either, because I know that you probably have enough of that on your hands. So what you're going to want to do is focus on these 3 main areas or components of the crafting process and try and make each of them special in its own way, like devote time to them. So the 3 areas: one is skills / proficiency, the second is materials, and the third is place. So with skills and proficiency, what I mean is, if your player wants to create or craft something, is there an actual mechanic? Like, do they actually have the skills or the proficiencies to do so? Now, if they're an artificer, then that's right up their alley. In fact, if you have an artificer in your campaign, you really need to try and push them towards crafting items, because it's such a enriching part of that entire class is the fact that they can create stuff. And there's even some mechanics there where it's like, okay, like I believe Xanatar's even adds like, oh, if they are, level 10 plus, then they get, it costs half the gold half the time, that kind of stuff. But I think you could even play into that a little bit more and just, let them use their artificer skills a little bit more creatively. And on top of that, for other people, let's say that you have a priest in your group and they want to work on crafting a holy item, so to speak, right? It's going to be a magical item, but with either, some type of effect that is on the holier side. Now that I could totally see you having a story legitimate reason to be like, yeah, you can totally work on this, and really leaning into their roles for the religion and everything like that. But on top of that, I think that you just need to like let the players kind of pitch to you, and if they have a bad explanation, then it's okay to be like, okay, it's going to be a little bit of a harder roll because it seems like your player doesn't realize how hard it is to make an item. But otherwise, if they have a good kind of explanation, like if they're a ranger and they want to create some, like some arrows, for example. I know for a lot of times in my campaigns, I don't really have people count arrows, but if you do, if you have that kind of hyper realistic accountability, then it's also totally up a ranger's alley to actually create their own arrows, and you need to keep that in mind. So that's kind of the skills and proficiency part. You need to make sure that they can actually explain why they are able to create something. And if it's a higher level thing, like creating crafting a sword or armor or something that you need like forging capabilities for, then that's going to take a lot of explanation. They might need to like spend some time devoted to like actually learning that, and then you could give them that kind of ability. And another kind of aspect of the skills and proficiencies, a lot of times there are, like toolkits that don't get utilized at all during, like when people are going throughout an adventure, like an alchemists or a cartographers or cooks or anything like that. Those are great opportunities. Like if your player has one of those, then have them actually justify using that. And if they do justify using it, then, make it so that it actually is possible. And if they don't, maybe you say, hey, okay, you want to create your own cloak. Well, do you have a weaver's toolkit? No? Okay, well, you're going to have to go get that. And that might be a nice, easy requirement that's like, oh, it's not impossible for them to get, but it would show that they are using essentially the tools of the trade, right? Now, speaking of getting materials, I think that this is probably the part that is most underutilized. For example, in the core rules, it talks a lot about like just essentially doing a gold cost, like in exchange for creating the item. It's like, oh, you're just spending a lot of time to make up for that gold cost. So essentially you're trading time for money. And that just, one, spending that time becomes a bother for the players and isn't fun. Two, it doesn't, I mean, think about all the great stories, right? It's like they take the dragon's tooth and they turn it into a dagger or a sword, right? Or they get some mithril from the mountain, like mines, and then they turn that into armor. And all of it is like, okay, you get a rare material, turn it into a rare item. And that's what you really need to bring into any kind of crafting. And I'm not saying you need to make it impossible, because there are all sorts of rare materials, ranging from, like I said, a dragon's tooth, which is on the higher end, all the way down to, a goblin shaman's eye, right? Used for something more, kind of still rare, but not game breaking, right? Not legendary. And when your players are like, oh, I'd like to create something, and let's say they're really excited and they have this really cool idea, and maybe it's like, oh, that's kind of a sick item. Maybe it's a little, game breaky of an item. Not exactly, but it's like a big get for them. And you don't want to just be like, okay, pay this much money and you get it. Because that it almost feels too easy and too hard, where it's like, okay, like you're either charging them like enough gold that they're going to have to save up for a bit, and that kind of sucks, or they have enough gold and then they just pay it and it feels cheap. What you want to do is be like, okay, you have this, let's call him Johnny. Johnny, you want to build, you want to make this bow that's incredible. Okay. Instead of, you being a smart DM, instead of saying, okay, fork over 1,000 gold and we'll call it good, 1,000 gold, couple days, we're good. Instead, you'll be like, okay, your player goes to this craftsman, and the craftsman is like, oh yeah, you can use my station. And then he's like, oh, if you want to build something like that, you're going to need the tendon of a griffin. And then you have a quest. That's what I was leading to. You need quests to be tied with your material gathering, and it's going to make the process a lot better. Because I find that a lot of the issue here is I see a lot of DMs who aren't flexible in their thinking with, like, if they do give a material requirement, like the tendon string of a griffin, like I just said, right? They'll say that to a player who is, level 7. They're not going to reach the griffin, habitat for another 5 levels and a billion sessions from now. And of course, if you tell them that, then they're going to get discouraged. They're not going to care. What you need to do is be like, okay, they're wanting to build this thing, and I don't want them to lose excitement for it, but I want them to actually feel like it's possible, but that they have to go through some work. What I'm going to tell them is, I'm going to tell them this requirement. They're going to start asking around, and then I'm going to give them, kind of dish up a quest that either happens very soon or that is kind of along the path. That could be like, oh, a random villager's like, oh, I heard there was a griffin attack at this small dairy farm down the road. Perfect, right? Works super well. On the other hand, it could be like, oh, griffins don't really come around these parts, but they are across this little sea here, in the country of 4 trees, for example. And what could happen there is be like, oh my goodness, our characters are going there next after we leave this town. We're hopping on a boat and going over to the country of 4 trees. That is a great time. That's a great way to do it too, because it's like, it's not immediate gratification, but you're like, hey, yeah, you can't build this really cool bow that you want right now, but guess what? At the next location, remember this, because you'll be able to do that. And that's a much better way to do than just like either immediately being like, oh yeah, I'll take your gold. Okay, really cool item. Here you go. And it's also better than being like, oh, that's a really cool item. Oh, too bad that you need the arch lich's, skull for this, and that's a level 19 boss. You're not gonna shatter their hopes by putting the goal or the quest like a million miles up the road, so to speak. But you still want to take that time to make it so that they either like serendipitously, where they didn't expect to find it and they found it, or they can actually have their eye on the goal still because it's near enough for them to be able to get that material that you required, right? So that's kind of the material, right? We've covered skills and proficiencies, materials. Now, I mentioned place, and this is maybe more of a side note and an immersion aspect, but depending on the equipment type, you really want to play up, like, you want to set the scene, right? You want the players to justify the scene in which they're able to make it. If they are, if they're scribing a scroll, they can do that kind of anywhere, right? It's not a big deal. If they're making a cloak, maybe you are like, okay, this is a pretty crude, simple cloak, that they're using some harpy feathers for, kind of not super high level, but somewhat. I can give it to them, that they can work on it by the campfire, so to speak, while they're traveling. But maybe you're like, oh, you really want to make this cloak out of, the finest spider silk of the Spider Queen. Then guess what? Maybe at that point, you don't just be like, oh yeah, you can just do that by the fire. Maybe you have to be like, okay, you have to find a very specific weaver in the next, in the kingdom's capital, who has a loom in which you could actually make something like this. And especially when it comes to making armor or weapons, blacksmithing, you really want to actually like set up a place or have them look for a place that has a forge, that has tools, that, like, think about any of the amazing like smithing scenes in Lord of the Rings, or even in the Marvel movies where they're building like Thor, a new hammer axe, right? In any of those things, it's like, oh, they have to go to a specific place. There's, I mean, even Sauron, even he had to go to Mount Doom to make the ring, right? He didn't just do it next to the campfire. And part of that builds a really cool scene. So try and do that too. That's it's a missed opportunity if you're just like, yeah, you in your spare time, next to the fire, you just craft up a six sword. No, that's not realistic, and it's also not cool. So make time for that, and actually like make a place, or at least tell them about a place that they can travel to, where they can make that. And I think all of this, if you kind of focus on, the material gathering, the place, the proficiencies, then what's going to happen is you're not focusing on what could be really bogging the fun down, which is time. Because sometimes, like in the core rules, they essentially are like, oh, crafting takes time, period. And time isn't fun for the players. And that's why it's much better to actually be like, hey, instead of time, the time you spend is fulfilling a quest to get the materials. The time you spend is to search around and ask people and to plan, right? The time isn't spent during the crafting process, right? So like once they actually have all the materials, then give them like a day or 2 or 3 of downtime where they actually need to make it, but have the actual real amount of time be spent just gathering and preparing. And then it's going to be a lot more fun, right? And so in the end, what I would say is make item crafting attainable, make it story driven, and also make the quality of the equipment balanced with the difficulty of obtaining the materials for it. And so with that, I hope that you get out and that you encourage your players, right? If no one has tried crafting, then throw them a bone. Give them like, oh, you killed this really cool creature. Oh, its heart can be used for something. And then lead them by the hand, so to speak, into crafting some items and equipment for themselves. And I think you'll be really happy with the results. I hope you have a wonderful time DMing and crafting items. And until next time, let's roll initiative.
Thanks again for listening to our show. If you like our content and would like to engage with more of it, head over to our Instagram account @HowToBeABetterDM and give us a follow. Make sure to watch some of our Dungeon Master Rules videos while you're there to give yourself some more structure and procedure as a Dungeon Master. Also, don't forget to reach out with a DM and we can talk shop and I can get to know you a little bit better. Thanks again for listening.